All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us for our next session in today's event, Total Rewards in Action, Bridging Strategy and Technology for Maximum Impact. This is sponsored by HRSoft. The webcast has been pre-approved for one HRCI business credit as well as one SHRM credit. So please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive those credits. You'll receive an email from hr.com always within 2 business days, and the credit will also be in your hr.com account within 24 hours. So during this presentation, we will have a couple of poll questions for engagement, as well as if you have questions for the presenters, we ask that you place those in the Q&A in your webinar controls, then they won't get buried in the chat. And we encourage you to engage in the chat. You choose everyone from the drop-down box and can all engage together. All right, that is all the logistics on my end. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Glizelle Ditto to get us started.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Again, my name is Glizelle Ditto, and I will be leading us through the discussion today. I have joined me Sean Rabel and Michelle Miller as well, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Just before we get started, I wanted to get into a little bit of housekeeping. Again, we'll be covering the notion of total rewards and action and looking at how we can bridge your strategies with your technologies. If you do have any questions, as Rhonda had mentioned, please feel free to chime in the chat on any questions. I also have my colleague Abby Sandbach on the line as well, who will be monitoring those questions as we go. So again, feel free to ask those at any time, but we'll try to reserve some time at the end as well. Again, my name is Glizelle Ditto, and I have been with HRSoft now I'm actually in my 6th year with the organization, but I've worked and consulted with many organizations across all industries for the better part of nearly 3 decades now as a compensation and rewards practitioner, and also working mainly on the technology side as a consultant. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass that over to Sean to do a little intro as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm Sean Rabel. I'm based out of Vancouver, BC, Canada. So I do consulting work in compensation benefits and HR ops and systems primarily. And so it's called Game Plan Total Rewards. But I've been consulting for 5 years, but I was in-house for 20 years, working for different companies from small startups to large multinationals. Probably hit at least 34 plus countries in my global work. So I really enjoy diving into the comp space and technology and helping clients figure out what are the right solutions. So excited to be here today and share some of my learnings and advice. So thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Sean.
Hi, everyone. I am Michelle Miller. I am an HR consultant with Hub International. I focus on compensation strategies, HR technology as well, with a focus on total rewards. I've done human resources for just about 25 years now.
Awesome. So it sounds like we have very similar backgrounds. This is going to be a great conversation. With that, I want to go ahead and get started with an initial poll. So I want to find out from the folks that are on the line, what is your organization's biggest challenge in compensation planning and total rewards? And these are some pretty common ones that I think we're seeing in industry, thinking about the technology integration, strategy alignment, data management, employee communications, and budget constraints. I know a lot of you probably want to pick more than one, but just curious kind of what's top of mind today. I'll just give you a few more seconds to respond to that. Oh, very interesting. So thank you for that. It looks like in the responses, the top 2 answers are budget constraints and strategy alignment. And I can see how those things can be pretty neck and neck. Coming up as a close third is looking at technology integration. So that's great. Those are all topics that we're going to be covering today. Really good to know kind of where we're starting. So with that, I think I want to start off by just having a little conversation amongst us about different industry trends that we're seeing, specifically kind of looking at what's happening today in the world, how that's actually just to kind of set the stage, how the total reward space is evolving and changing based on some of those industry trends and what might actually be causing some of that. I think just initially from my own point of view, I know I've seen a lot of focus specific on holistic well-being, and it kind of goes beyond, traditional benefits and things like that, looking at health, mental health, benefits, and even going into financial health with a lot of the struggles that we've been having. But I want to kick that off specifically with Sean, just to kind of talk a little bit about what you're seeing with your customers that you're consulting with.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, there's so many forces at play. And so I think when we're looking at what our clients, we're thinking about these kind of three parts. So it's what's the market doing, what are our employees looking for, and then what's our business
Hmm.
strategy. And so these things, sometimes there's a little more stability in the market, and then sometimes you get these volatility and things that are happening. You're like, okay, every force at play. My employees are looking for more money, they're stretched, right? Cost, and then you've got companies that are like, should we freeze? Should we slow down salaries? Right, we're dealing with other forces at play. And then the market's doing kind of what should we follow them? Should we lead? What should we do? And so one of the things that's I think the biggest thing is really getting grounded in our data. So we really, when we think about where is the biggest fire or highest turnover or higher absenteeism or the longer time to hire a certain role. And so really getting a sense of your data to help drive how you prioritize the work is super important because sometimes somebody comes in the office or a virtual office now and say, we have an issue, we need to raise the salaries for this group in this location. Okay,
Hmm.
tell me, but let the data help us understand the true sense of urgency against all the things that we're trying to do. So having that talent dashboard, that data is so critical, even more so than ever, to understand what's really happening in terms of our own internal landscape so that we can really prioritize our work. That's like the number one thing. And then the other big thing is where we get data. So on the market side,
Right.
there's more and more places to get data. So we're going, well, what about that one? And really understanding the source of the data, how it's connected, how more current. And so we're seeing things that are like live data from HRS systems. We're seeing from offer letter data. Like there are new platforms and things that are really pushing the envelope on market data. What is the true cost of
Yeah.
labor now, and by skill and by level? And it's fascinating, but then it becomes overwhelming. And so what we try and do is help go,
Right.
these are all the possible market data options, these are the different price points, because then you always will have, here's a recruiting agency survey, right? And they produce products, which we look at because employees see it, they're public. So we want to see multiple data. We want intel from our recruiting teams to really understand what are we seeing in the landscape of not just one survey. So I think the market data landscape, that's really shifting. And so it's helping organizations navigate, well, what are the options? How do I do that? How do I plug in for my industry or size? Because it gets really difficult, right? Because it's not as after the pandemic, right? There was just sometimes less participation in surveys. So we saw like number of
Right.
observations drop. So using some of the new tools and talking about AI, like help us look at these trends and the data integrity and multiple surveys and as we grow up as comp people, these are the best practices, 2 or 3 sources, and you hit half of your organization and 2/3 your job. Like so the challenge of meeting our professional standards with today's landscape is it's intense. It's probably the right word, but you
Yeah.
need to have good data
Yeah.
plan. Yeah, that's kind of the things I would share right now.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is kind of driven by a lot of what we've seen in terms of high turnover, a lot of competitiveness in the market, specifically probably for certain positions and whatnot.
Yeah.
I know that's something that I've been seeing too, but I'm curious to drill a little bit deeper into that, even as we think about how we're analyzing that data and some of those challenges that we're seeing. Um, it's also, to me, it's a little bit of looking at different people in their different demographics, so starting to not just get into how many years of experience somebody has or how long they've been with the company, but then drilling into where are they within their career as well, sort of by level, but I think it's a little bit deeper than that because it also talks to kind of what their personal situations are and what's kind of forcing their hand in looking at maybe looking for a higher salary or looking for some help in one end. I think I've
So,
I've
so
also
true.
heard some interesting things around like with financial health and different things that we can do, not just giving them more money, but what can we do to help them manage their money better? Or with these college grads coming out of school with these massive loans, and you see all of these different um, student loan repayment programs that organizations are offering too. So I'm curious if that's starting to come up in your world, or even Rhonda on your side as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can say definitely the skill base. So really showing it's not about the number of years experience, or it's around can you deliver that skill? Can you do that work? Especially in like technical jobs, software engineering. So it's kind of it's really challenging our job evaluation structures, leveling structures, and like it's outcome based. Can you prove that you can do that type of work? Because people are learning things at different paces, and so it's just because you've been here for 15 years and what it's can you deliver the expectations, right? And so we'll reward for that the skill, the proven skill. So it's evolving some of those pieces. I think that's a huge kind of shift.
Yeah,
We have to not every organization's the same, right? You can't just look at a job title the same. So it comes down to
sure.
your org design, your role expectations, what true skills you need, and focus them because you can't focus on every skill, but what skills? There's been a few papers about this or blogs about what skills do you really need that are your competitive difference that you need to look at, above the line. This is our differentiator. So skills below the line, yeah, it's part of, sure. But things above the line where there's a differentiation for our customers, right? And the products we're delivering, the service, that's where you
Yeah,
want to have that winning strategy when it comes to total rewards design. Yeah.
makes sense. So Michelle, just from your perspective too, I know we've had some conversations about again, drilling into this data. What are you seeing on your side with the consulting that you're doing?
Sure. It's interesting that Sean just mentioned looking at industry and what is it that our clients specialize in. I did just actually work with a client who has a very, very specialized skill set that is required. And so the market data didn't speak to that. So we had to get creative and kind of think outside the box, if you will, about what it is that is required. So what's above that line that Sean referred to, and then kind
Yeah.
of build their strategy around compensation and some of the other total rewards that we were exploring to meet what their expectations were. And so it got a little tricky, but some creative minds and just thinking outside that box, as I mentioned, and not being so married to just compensation data that we might find out there and taking into account some of those other factors.
Yeah, I think the name of the game here is that we all are really starting to have to think out of the box, and it's not so cut and dry, and it's not a straight analysis that we've been so used to in the past. We're having to take into account so many other factors, and
Yeah.
especially to your point, when you start dealing with very specialized positions. And I think there's also an overwhelming trend in having more specialized positions in different industries too. I think a lot of that has to do with the technology that's being introduced throughout all the different organizations that we're thinking about. But that skill set is shifting, and it's causing us to have to kind of shift that much faster when we're doing this analysis. So that's great input.
Yeah.
So just thinking about continuing this conversation, I don't think we can really get into this conversation about total rewards without really talking about employee value proposition, because I think that's the key pillar to all of this. So I wanted to kick that over to you, Michelle, first to get your input on that.
Definitely, thank you. Yeah, if we think about, how the landscape has changed over the last several years, I think from an HR perspective, we could all argue that everything has changed, right? And so how is it that we really think about what it is that we need to bring to the table? And so a critical piece of total reward strategy has been focused on employee value proposition. And I'll start with, asking my clients, what is it that, your EVP is for your organizations? And generally, it's probably 50-50. Some organizations have strong EVPs in place, others don't. And that opens up the conversation to have with them about why it's so important to have an EVP in place. And so a lot of times, what I'll hear from clients is what they focus on is kind of what that top talent looks for, how they can develop and retain their people. But what I don't often hear them say and what we focus on is how is it that they truly try to understand their people? How is it that they consider everyone's needs? And understanding this notion that the truth is that one size fits none, right? It is not a one size fits all. And so really focusing on and understanding their employee population. And so we've seen this seismic shift over the last several years. I think we're all aware of it in the HR world. It's been driven by greater adoption of these technologies that we're faced with. The global pandemic had a huge effect, and just the overall market upheaval. And this really is all contributing to what employees are experiencing. And so, from a total reward standpoint, the pendulum really is starting to swing, and we need to be more people centric versus the whole prior approach of the early 2000s, 2019s, 2020s of the employer knows best approach. And I think if organizations can start to make that shift, they'll start to see some differences in how they can really bring to the table some benefits to their employees. And so,
That makes total sense.
yeah, as I think about, the EVP and how that can come into play, really expanding on what it is that we can offer to our employees and really thinking about what their needs are. If we think about just life events in general, they face lots of things. It can be a childcare issue, they've got a sick parent, they just got a puppy. How is it that we can appreciate those things about our employees and be able to support them through those life events? And so that's really where an EVP can tie into your total rewards and getting organizations to look at their total rewards inventory. So everything from compensation to the benefits that we offer to that work-life balance, our performance and recognition programs, things of that sort, and really offering and making them aware of what that total benefits package is and how it is that organizations can support them. And I think that's where HR's role really comes into play, and being the advocate for that EVP and getting our stakeholders involved to support our EVP initiatives, and then weaving those into our HR programs. How is it that we can align those with our performance management programs, our compensation programs, and things of that sort? And then communicating it would probably be my last comment about EVP, is making sure employees are aware of that EVP, put it in our corporate brands. It can drive engagement, tie it into any type of engagement surveys that we might do. We can reinforce it in our recruiting messages. So there's lots of ways to really tie in EVP when I think about total rewards.
So it's kind of interesting because I think we kind of keep going back to, again, the notion that we need to look at our employee population and really dig deep and understand what our population looks like. And again, from organization to organization, that's going to be very different. And I don't even think that there's necessarily any specific industry trends per se, based on the industry that you're seeing. I think there's a lot of personalization that we keep going back into. Again, where those employees are within their career, what's going on in their lives, what things they're struggling with, and what's important to them. This also, I feel like, goes back to some of those pressures or friction points that we've been seeing too. You mentioned the pandemic and people still kind of coming back from that. But as a result of that, having the majority of the companies out there, I think, working in a hybrid, like remote work type of a situation, and some organizations that I think have shifted to completely remote, others that are trying to bring everybody back into the office, and most everybody probably falling somewhere in between. So I want to dig into that a little bit more too with the two of you, just thinking about those types of pressures and knowing that personalization is kind of the key to this. How can we, as an HR team, look at still continuing to strategically align appropriately when we're thinking about what our specific, as an organization, what our goals are as an organization? How does this personalization and such really feed into that? And how can we help to keep things aligned and fair and equal and whatever that looks like, knowing that it's leaning so much into personalization? Um, I don't know if either one of you want to kind of take that.
I can start. Yeah. I think the biggest thing is, and this is something that's been on for a while, is kind of these transformational dialogues. So when you think about total rewards and the EVP and everything that goes in, it's these ongoing dialogue you need to have with your organization with different levels, right? Leadership, management, frontline employees. Yes, there's all the digital and virtual stuff, but when you can get boots on the ground and see the white of their eyes and actually talk to people, having this ongoing transformational dialogue, because you're never done, right? And once you say, here's our EVP, here, oh, something changed, right? A market factor, employee factor, or right, or a business strategy, a restructure, a new technology implementation. So I think the dialogue is important and how that looks and getting boots on the ground, really understanding what it feels like and how they receive information. What does that or testing our tools, right? So a lot of times we work with clients and they're just like, I've never actually called the EAP line. Like, so trying and testing, our own tools that we provide, whether that's the internet site or it's the actual call line or whatever it is, testing it, right? Does it work? Simple stuff like that. Our vendors that do short-term disability, long-term, like support and do care, how are those case managers working on it? They are also an organization. Do you have a good agreement with them? Do you have the scripts? Do you have an SLA that if they don't always call the manager for a mental health case, that there's a penalty? And I've actually put in SLAs with penalties, and all of a sudden we were getting checks. I was like, we're not revenue generating. We shouldn't be getting checks, but we're getting checks because
Interesting.
I can't shop you because we've got a long relationship with you. But if you can't get and always follow the process for, especially a mental health related claim, then we have an issue, right? And so getting stronger with our vendors, our partner, they're an extension of our teams and they're interacting with our employees and their families at the most critical times. So it's really digging into our programs or processes and having those dialogues, making sure we're aligned. And a lot of the times it's, yeah, what we at C-suite or the executive might think is important, people prefer, might be different and for the employees. And we've done these in these total rewards or EV projects where we ask the question, we do the surveys of like, what are you satisfied with? What are your preferences? And we do that all levels. We do focus groups. We understood the data and then we share it. We're like, I thought they really loved that discount. Actually, they don't, they really just want more personal time off, right? So there's that piece that's happening. And because you can't make everybody happy, right? And you've got costs keep going up. And so the personalization force with cost is finding creative solutions that still give people choice, but keeps within our total dollars. And so we did this where we actually had over market short-term disability policy, but we were a little under in PTO. And through that project, we rebalanced it. So it was net zero. But the employees said, yeah, we know we'll have a 100% S to D for that many weeks. We're okay coming that down to 2/3 if we give it some personal time. And we did. We were able to make it work. And so we
That
rebalanced
makes sense.
things, right? And the employees were engaged through that process. And we provided some choice, some personalization in that. I think the other one I see is companies starting to use technology to say, here's your rewards wallet. And so every quarter, one organization in Toronto, they actually will rebalance between equity and cash. So you as an employee, there's rules built into the tool. Now, not everybody has a team of software engineers unless you're a bigger company or you're in that space. But knowing what organizations are doing, what's coming, that could be more available to more organizations is this choice, right? As long as you follow these rules every quarter, you could mix because I need more cash. I got stuff happening in my family and I equity is great right now, but I want to bring that down to this percentage and a little more cash. This is incredible. Like I love this stuff because it's trying to the pressure from a CEO is like is our financials. But if you can play within the budget or find us, because it's like, well, I want savings. I want it's really tough, right? Comp and Ben is the largest SG&A, right? So it's figuring out where do you rebalance. And sometimes there's dollars in your benefit plans, whether you're paying extra commissions versus it should be a fixed fee. Like we found $90,000 in extra broker commission fees because it was a commission model, not a fixed fee. And they never changed it. They just kept growing, adding employee lives, and they never changed it. $90,000 a year extra. Like, so that's the kind of stuff where when you want to do personalization and you want to do this great work, where is there dollars potentially you can shift or find to help support them? Yeah.
That makes sense. What about you, Michelle? Anything to add to that too?
I think what I want to highlight that Sean mentioned is the key is we can do all of these great things around total rewards, right? We can find all these dollars, lift and shift, do all those fun things. But if our employees don't know what we have to offer, we're back at square one.
Huge.
So I think once we make all these strategic decisions kind of behind the scenes, we've surveyed employees, we've gotten their input, we've made those decisions. We now need to communicate that to our employees and over communicate, if you will. So think of, strategies around how can we continue to make our employees aware of all of these things, some of which they may have asked for, we've implemented them, but
Yeah.
continuing to make them aware. And so that's where I also think it's important to think about how it can be embedded into whether it be brand strategy, HR programs,
Yep.
different ways to just, we need to keep our finger on the pulse with all of those things that we
Yeah.
implement.
Totally true.
So I think that's super, super important.
Can I add one
Makes a lot of sense.
example? Yeah,
Yeah,
we had
absolutely.
for our 401k program, we actually had employees help us build video to market it. So we
Oh,
Oh,
did a
nice.
contest where they created, back in, they were creating YouTube videos, and probably today they'd use an AI agent, right, or something to create
Yeah.
video, but to help explain for every dollar you get a dollar, like, and they were having so much fun with it, and so
Well, that's
engaging
great.
marketing, but also employees, right, and in terms of
right.
content, because that's really is like it's almost like a marketing strategy, but for employees, right?
I
And
love that.
and the lens of the customer, these are the different touch points and what their needs are. Think about the employees. It's this marketing strategy, and so
Yeah.
really cool. We had a lot of fun with it. We picked, and it was just like great. Everybody was like, I'm opting into that. Like it just created a buzz. So I think sometimes the best ideas come from outside of, the HR team. It's the employees or the
Yeah.
marketing team. They're like, oh, this. And so that was really fun. It was I hadn't seen that before we did it. I was like, this is brilliant. Like I love,
That's incredible.
yeah, it was fun.
Yeah,
I
that's actually
TikTok for
fascinating.
HR.
Yeah,
It challenges us,
TikTok
right?
for
It's like, wait,
HR. I
a
love it.
video contest? But yeah, you could create
right.
mini movies like 401k, it was just like
That's
amazing.
great.
Like, all of a sudden they're different scenes. I was like, it was blowing
Yeah.
away. Yeah.
I
It's
think when we
interesting that
can,
you say that. Sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
I'm sorry, I was just going to comment. It's interesting, employees want to feel like they're people, not employees. And so that's a perfect way to show them that they are part of this greater organization. And
Yeah.
we see them as a person
Yeah.
versus just an employee that's on our
Yeah.
payroll.
Yeah. Their voice
I'm gonna
matters,
have to
right?
use that honestly because it's I think it accomplishes a couple of things. It's helping the employees to understand, if they're having to present on something, they absolutely have to get a good understanding of what that is.
Mhm.
But the whole objective around this is employee engagement and to make sure that, to your point, they're feeling like they're part of the whole. And
Yeah.
that's a great way to actually bring them into
Yeah.
this whole conversation when it comes to communications and whatnot. It also sounds like just based on the things that we've been talking about so far, the name of the game is really around being agile, right? To your point, it's a constant research, a constant pivoting, constantly looking for feedback from your employees and basically being able to manage to that
Yeah.
feedback. And I feel like this space is becoming more than just, again, our standard annual enrollment period where we're starting to relook at the benefits and such. It becomes something that we can look at different ways that we can pivot. And I think, to be honest, in my world, I feel like going into that pandemic era for us was a great lesson in we're in the middle of the year. What the heck do we do? And what do we do to help our employees? And I think that's just perpetuated since that time period. If anything, good comes out of that. It taught us to be a little bit more agile. So that's great. Um, I think as part of this too, I want to get into you touched on it a little bit earlier, Sean, just around global considerations too.
Mm.
It's hard enough thinking about US based, even North America based, but you start getting into organizations that truly have a global presence and thinking about what considerations we need to have as global organizations or even those that are working in the global footprint, even though maybe our employees are not necessarily
Yeah.
global, but that's almost inevitable with most organizations. So just want to get your take on this first, Sean, just thinking about what are the complexities that we need to consider when we're looking at a global organization.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, so definitely have learned from the ground, supporting global, probably 30 countries over my time. And even today, we work with multi-country organizations, and part of it is, yeah, understanding the labor laws, right, and understanding, where there's pay equity, pay transparency, and there's nuances by obviously jurisdictions or states or provinces, or you get into Europe. So understanding the legislation land and having that repository, and you've got to keep it fresh because things are changing. Then it's making understand
Mhm.
inventory what you have, right? And sometimes you have a smaller a country with maybe only 5 people. We had somewhere, so we had different strategies for under 10 employees versus over 10 when in terms of pay structure and how we would develop certain things. So really, some of the best practices that I learned from, my VP of Total Wars back in the day was, really thinking about those smaller ones, the mid-size, right? But you still need to have that inventory of the legislation because sometimes you would see something you're like, I love what they're doing in Norway. Can we do that?
Mhm.
Can we be more transparent? Because if you go to Norway, you can see it, everybody's salary is publicly posted. All their tax. It's quite interesting. And one a very transparent country, Norway.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean you have to do it, but when you see what other continents, countries are doing, like it's just in the U.S., California, New York, should we apply that all the way through in terms of our approach?
Right.
I mean, you have to, but I think knowing it, I think the culture piece, right? So where people feel in terms of themselves, so the human centered of, do I feel I identify part of the LGBTQ community, right? And so do I feel comfortable when I traveled and I used to go travel to China, right? So can I be my full self, right? In terms of just what cultural
Mhm.
norms are and safety, right? And so understanding when we think about our programs and policies and inclusive benefits, inclusive leave policies, how will that be in those countries? And it's really important to understand those perspectives and the cultural norms and even just how they may talk with management, right? And so hierarchical, right?
Right.
Versus, you know what, I'm not going to ask, I want feedback. Well, I don't want to give feedback, right? So there's got to be a level of trust in the right setting. And so understanding how business works, really important and critical to understand and ask questions, not make assumptions. And so that's, I was part of the only Canadian of a US international team, and so I was
Mhm.
sitting, and so I always had that kind of the outsider perspective. And so whether I was traveling to Turkey or UK or China or Mexico, to me, I always had that perspective of how do we make sure we really understand the local norms, culture, nuances, and then take that back. And so, I mean, the last thing I'll say is I do mental health work as well in training and anti-stigma. But we always understand like, well, what's even available? Like we did one where it was US, Canada, Mexico, Vietnam, right? I mean, the resources are very different by country, right?
Yeah.
And this sense of safety and to be able to talk about it. So yeah, to me, it's having that inventory, having that landscape, having that knowledge of what it really feels like to be and where you can really, because you just can't make assumptions. You got to be curious, but then document that information that you find to help you build your total word strategies and try and figure out, like you see companies, big companies going, we're going to do a global leave policy. Everybody gets at least 12 weeks of this, or at least, right? We're trying to get those minimums, but it's hard. That is not easy work to do.
Yeah.
I applaud companies that try and get those global, PTO or leave policies. It's fascinating. And hard to do, but I love the challenge of that. And I think that's what we should be trying to do is what can we do that can be global applied, right? Our cultures, some of
Sure.
these nuances in our EVP. But then there are usually some differentiation that we still have to abide by. So
That makes total sense. I think that bleeds right into you mentioned a little bit about pay transparency and whether it's laws versus practice. And I think a lot of the organizations that I've personally worked with tend towards what's the most restrictive, and try to implement that across the board. But I think that gets even trickier when you start dealing with a global organization because to your point, you've got your companies, in Norway, your presence in Norway and other places where they are miles ahead of where we are here
yeah,
in the US or even in Canada when you're thinking about pay transparency laws. And I think part of that too is to not lose sight of the purpose behind those, because I think that's what we're also getting stuck
right.
in this world is that we're trying to make sure that we are following the regulations, but um, as we've seen, as we've started to roll out different laws here in the US, like state by state or even certain cities and municipalities, you're getting people, just as an example, people that are posting these wild and crazy ranges just
Yeah.
because they need to post a range, and then it's not doing anybody any good because
Mhm.
you're not actually honing in on what you're truly trying to hire for in that particular job.
Yeah.
Wanted to know if either you or Michelle had any other input on that and just even guidance around that and what's the best practice as we're thinking about transparency across the board, whether it is trying to adhere to the laws, or what are you advising your customers to do when they are having to look at those different jurisdictions?
Michelle, do you want to take this one to start, or
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And yeah, feel free to jump in, Sean. Yeah, I think one of the most important things here is taking a close look at your compensation policies. You want to make sure that you're compliant from the standpoint of the various, specifically the state regulations, especially for those organizations that have multi-state work locations. So taking a look at those and really understanding what each of the state requirements are. I think almost all of the clients that come my way have multi-state work locations. And so their first question usually is, help me understand what it is I need to do. What can I put into place to help educate my organization as well? Because you want to make sure your organization and your leaders kind of are your extensions of HR. So it's making sure that the appropriate people are informed as well.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And then the other piece we consult on is the job architecture and job leveling structure, which then drives your kind of pay band design. And so uh, and sometimes it's the kind of that building block, right? So hey, let's make sure we got our job architecture, job families, subfamilies, our kind of a leveling evaluation system. We do look at kind of where there's pay equity laws, and in Canada, like at federal, we've got Ontario, Quebec, but the principles of those are around fair pay, right? And so we think about the weighting responsibilities versus skills education versus working conditions. So even if you don't have to be compliant with some of those, your evaluation tool and looking at how those are built when they are required, do you have those right factors? How are they weighted, right? That's a key piece. And then the education for, yeah, hiring managers, having kind of that mid to mid, usually there's a hiring range, not the whole thing we hear. And then it becomes, but the education for managers and employees. So they see that. So you have to have this kind of, we build like a plan, like, okay, here's the structure. Let's make sure internally we're all good. And then getting things on the posting when we're ready. But until you're ready internally, it's hard to put the full thing. You might say, we're going to adjust our hiring band a little bit lower because we still have to work through some internal stuff, right? We're not ready. I saw one organization, they were just like, our ranges are coming. They're just like, we're not ready. Like they were like, we know, because what happens is we heard this from a company in Seattle. They did the transparency and they're like, okay, we're ready for all the internal questions. They had a few questions. They had more applicants come through for their jobs than they expected. They were running out of recruiting hours. They're like, how are we going to, because it increases trust. So it has value. You have an opportunity to talk about your whole EVP to Michelle's point earlier. Like use this as let's just do the right thing, but let's use this as a great way to have a strong foundation that's flexible, that is fair, and then we can kind of apply these things. And that's the best practice. If you can actually just take the most conservative or in the most advanced kind of jurisdiction and apply it, do it. Why not? What are you afraid of? And I think that's kind of that piece. Like in Canada, we're doing pay transparency reports. And so we just, in British Columbia, and fines aren't there yet. So you can, if you don't post, you're not fined yet, but they're working on it. But here's the thing, these transparency reports, well, where do they go? Well, they're public. Everybody sees them. Yep. And we're going to be hitting by 2026 for organizations of 50 employees or more to do these pay transparency reports. And so our executives are like, well, how do I get ready? Well, job architecture, pay band, education. And so here you go, right? You can't, no one's in trouble if they ask about or talk about pay. You can't ask about their pay history. These policies, there's layers to them, right? That protect employees. And so I think understanding in Ontario, it's even different. They're going, oh, if you have AI in your recruiting, you have to be transparent, but they're using AI for recruiting. Like some of these policies by jurisdiction and by country will vary. So I like looking at it as globally as I can. Where do I operate and see, well, why wouldn't I just be clear about it everywhere that I use AI? Why do I have to just do it in Ontario? So I love seeing what's happening in Europe, right, or other markets and say, well, we're all going to go there anyways. Why don't I just challenge my organization? What are we afraid of? What are the fears that are holding us back? And then we crawl, walk, run with this stuff, measure a couple times before you cut. Because it's
Absolutely.
right. Anyways, I can go on and on about that one. It's I live
No,
it
and I love that.
So,
I love that. I think again, it's kind of drilling into that notion that transparency isn't it's actually showing the organization also that you're a work in progress. We all are, right? So even if you have something to show that it's coming, we're working on these things, and
Yeah.
knowing that your eyes are really kind of focused on the bigger picture,
Yeah.
even having that communication, it becomes part of that education that you're giving your employees around what your actual strategy is in this process. They want to know that you're looking at it and that you're doing something, knowing that in the end, if our objective is to really focus on that pay equity, you know, it's
Yep.
not just about posting ranges, it's helping people to understand that that's the strategy behind it, and that
Yeah.
we're not 100% there. We're
Yeah.
still growing. We're still trying to figure this out. I
Yeah.
think to that end too, kind of thinking about the data that we're using, kind of bleeds into a little bit of that next topic. We touched on it a little bit, but the notion of data is everywhere. You know, when we're thinking about market data, when we're thinking about how much should I get paid for the job that I'm in based on where I am and based on how much experience I have, there are so many places where I can potentially get some data, good or
Mhm.
bad, but
Yeah.
it's some data. And so I feel like that pushes the onus on us as professionals within the companies to make sure that our employees are aware of where our data is coming from, what our strategy is, and utilizing it, why maybe what they're searching for is maybe not the best place to grab data from, and educate them as to why.
Mhm.
Um, so I want to dig into that a little bit too, because again, I think we're all inundated with so much information.
Yeah.
And what's your advice in terms of working with organizations to make sure that they're getting this messaging out right? And maybe it actually uncovers with certain organizations that maybe they're not using the proper data either as you're consulting with them. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I'll kick that over to you first, Michelle.
Sure. Yeah, where you get your data from is so important. We can all go out to Google and put in a quick Google search for HR consultant and get a salary range from X to Y that it could be $100,000, right? And so, understanding the data that we're looking at, and you hit a key point, education. So, not only educating our employees, but educating leaders within our organization, to understand that Google search isn't necessarily data that has any type of backing, if you will, and nothing. There's no context behind it to support that quick Google search. Yeah, that's my initial thought around data. Sean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have more
Yeah,
to.
I think yeah, I agree with that. I think it's the education. So we usually do a slide or two that we take kind of leader, like our HR business partners, recruiters for, and then leaders, managers, and employees. And it's kind of that this is our data management kind of strategy, right? And so these are the sources we use, the surveys, and the difference and why it's we look at the number of observations by company, by incumbent. We look at industry cut revenue, things we get down to the job capsule, the type of job, the experience required, that we can do hybrid jobs. You're a mix of a few things. And so, yeah, not everybody's the same. So we will do that work. And these tools and these data sources allow us to do that custom work for our organization. So this is our data and how we interpret it and how often we refresh it. How do we age the data? Like giving them a little bit of the science behind it. So when you do an example, like here's 3 kind of M2 jobs in this area, we grab the P50, we vetted those, we blend them, and how do we build a pay band? Like showing a little bit of behind the curtain is okay, not the whole, what? I don't want to be
Right.
a comp expert, but I need to trust the data. And so if you got union shops, we're pulling these collective agreements on a regular basis. We want to monitor that, even if you're not a union shop and you have roles. So we do look at collective agreement information. We also will look at postings that are live because people are now sharing. Yes, it's an input. We will use AI and say, what is it? We're going to pull what people also see on these employee reported or other channels. And we will also bring intel from our recruiting sites. So when I work with our recruiting teams, so we used to work for a helicopter company. And I said, wow, where can we get pilot and mechanic information? Yeah, union contracts, but I want the latest, like, because sometimes they're in bargaining or whatever. So we would actually, for certain positions, actually track kind of the pay expectations for certain jobs. It doesn't be every job, or it was retail, store manager, customer service manager, department sales manager, like certain roles, we would just track, right? Like, what are we hearing live? And so now we've got
Mhm.
new platforms and software that plug into offer letter data, to plug into your HRS data. So there are some new solutions that didn't exist, 5, 10 years ago. So yeah, it's
Right.
education, it's understanding your data, sort of trying to get at least more than one. Sometimes it's like we don't have the budget for it. So maybe every second
Right.
year, get creative with our salary budget spend. And for the small organizations, unfortunately, it's harder to get if you don't have a budget for it. How do you get it? So you work with smaller, like independents, consultants, where you can get some quick pricing, out of cost. But you used to be able to buy from the big firms. Like, can I just have that subfamily? Can I just have that job as
Mhm.
$1 for the job? Great. And it came from the big firms. They don't offer those anymore, right? So back
Right. It's all or nothing.
ago when I started, you could actually get just
Yeah.
subfamily cut. It was really cool. Like, thanks,
Yeah.
right? Thanks, Sally. Thanks for that. It was perfect, right? And it was vetted and it was a piece, but you couldn't get it anymore. So because those big companies
Yeah.
have bought other survey companies, so the landscape's changed a lot. So yeah, I
Yeah.
could go on and on and get that one too. It's an important one though, because it's the
It
foundation
really is.
bands. So it's the data, the education, and tying it to your strategy. So I guess the last thing I would say is we look at business maturity, high growth, maturity, decline, and your market positioning might shift. So we want to have that conversation with our executives to align our market positioning to your strategy, because maybe we're a startup, we can't pay all those. We want P25 base, but higher on variable. So we do that kind of business strategy alignment, where you want the cycle to your pay position.
Yeah. And even just communicating that strategy just as a whole as well, to let employees understand, we're here in the life cycle of this
Yeah,
particular organization, and this is why we're paying the way we do.
yeah,
I think an extension to that, in addition to kind of teaching them at least a little bit of our strategy behind what our pay bands are, how we've actually looked at our jobs, but
yeah,
also even educating them on, if they do that Google search, or if they go to some of those free resources, or if you go to LinkedIn, what is that data? It's, sometimes it's crowdsourced data. It's people self-reporting, and how accurate is that? And how often do we actually do that?
yeah,
What is your data set that you're looking at? And is it even a
yeah,
viable data set to be gauging your requirements on? So I think doing a little bit of education in that as well, because again, everybody's sort of in that,
yeah.
Google mode where I
You
can
need to have the
just
most data as the
ask a
company.
question.
You need to have the
Yeah.
most
Right.
data. So when people come, like, I got this.
Yeah.
Do you have more data than me? Nope. Yeah, I have more data. I have that data. Plus I have this
Like,
data. Like you have
that's
to go
exactly
facts.
right.
I've had
Yeah.
CHROs go, it's kind of almost word for word. Do you have more data than me? No. Okay. Next. Like, I have more data. But
That is perfect.
elaborate, but like it is about the data. Like, if you have more data, you've done the vetting, but you need to see what they're looking at. Yeah. So
Yeah,
And I would
absolutely.
add too, I think from a total reward standpoint, it's just not that compensation piece, right? Total rewards
Mhm.
is our benefits that we offer. It's any bonuses or incentives that we offer.
whole pack.
So it's painting that full picture for our employees, for our leaders.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And like,
Yeah, and with that in mind, are you seeing that we're actually getting more reliable market data around that total rewards picture as well? Because I know we've been always focused so much on salary,
mm,
maybe salary plus variable.
yeah.
But what about that total rewards picture?
Oh, that's a good one. Whole other webinar. But yes, I mean, challenging our benefit providers to get the right data. So sometimes I find when we go in that the benchmarks are different for comp versus benefits. So we want to make sure that we're
Yeah.
really in sync in terms of size of company, industry cut. So that's usually a gap everywhere. I always start. I'm like, oh, we got to make sure we're aligned on that. So there's data there. I think variable pay is interesting, target versus actually paid. To be really mindful of when you look at total cash. And then getting into
Oh,
the equity piece. There's a few studies around that provide, and so we work with, if you get into executive comp, or what should the percentage or value be of a profit sharing or
mhm.
a LTIP program. So there are a few additional sources that you can get. Kind of what should that be as a general value, or what's my total spend of my net profit should be for variable pay. So there's a few studies, whether I'm
Mhm.
private or public sector, that we will bring in to supplement the total picture. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to, be able to have some access to. I know, again, there's that space is growing quite a bit. So it's just interesting to know that with us being focused so much more on the total package,
Yeah.
what data do we have to support that? So that's great.
Yeah, there was a
So,
client. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying there was a client that we pulled every best employer information we could. And so from the best
Mhm.
employer reports, what was differentiated by each best employer. So we created a mapping of that. So that's another intel of like what's different, So yeah.
Yeah,
We're
perfect.
at time though, hey?
So I do want to go ahead and kick off just this last survey question before we get into the last part of our conversation here. Just curious out of the group that has joined us, and again, thanks for joining us and sticking out with us. Which compensation technology tools does your organization currently use? And I think this actually is going to foot to some of the conversations that we've already been having about how we can leverage technology, but just curious specifically what's going on with our audience today.
We need music.
I know.
I'm not gonna sing though. Don't worry.
All right. So it looks like a pretty even mix kind of across the board. Not too many of our participants are on spreadsheets, relatively speaking. So that's actually great news. But knowing that there are quite a few companies out there or participants out there that are using multiple systems, I'm a big fan of that. Also noting that you might be leveraging your HRIS module. Again, if it works for the specific programs that you're executing on, great. The thing that I would say just a caution against as we're thinking about how we can leverage technology, understanding what we're actually doing strategically and making sure that we're able to execute those programs appropriately in whatever technology you're using. Don't let the technology force your hand in how you're actually executing on your process. So that's great. With that, I think we've just got a few more minutes here. I do want to dive a little bit deeper. I mean, we've had some conversations already around education. We've mentioned it several times. Um, when I think about education, and I think, Michelle, you actually brought this up too, it's not just educating your employees, but in educating your leaders and your managers. So I want to dive into that a little bit too before we kind of try to bring this to a close. I think, again, from my perspective, the thing that I've been seeing most often in most organizations, we can provide the technology to be able to give employees all the information that they want at their fingertips. And again, be able to even have some of that education baked into that communications that we're putting out there and have that be real time live throughout the year. So you see those shifts. But then what are organizations also doing to in turn help to educate the leaders and the frontline managers who are speaking to these employees on a daily basis? We need to make sure that that messaging is accurate and is appropriately expressing what our strategies are in the comp team. So wanted to get your take on that too, Michelle.
Sure. Yeah, that's so critical. Not only from the standpoint of, our stakeholders and our leadership buy-in, but it's then that education piece. So we create a great program, but how is it that we make sure that those tentacles off of HR that go down to the leaders stays consistent and the message is consistent. So I think it's educating through various trainings. It's educating through giving them resources for their toolbox. So is that an FAQ, giving them, a list of questions that, we as in HR, we can anticipate what our employees are going to want to know. So let's leverage an FAQ that our leaders can lean in on. It's a consistent message. They're not just, grasping for straws when an employee reaches them. It can be through communication. So maybe we send some organizational communications or we send updates to leadership via communications. So those are just a few that are top of mind, how we can really make sure that we're focusing on the education piece. I think
Right.
too, performance evaluation time is another good time to kind of refresh where we're at with compensation and total rewards and reminding managers of what are the programs that we have in place that we'll be tapping into during performance evaluation periods.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And I think one thing that I've seen in particular with the technologies that we put in place for our customers, uh, even as you're getting into that annual process of, managing your salary reviews and at the same time maybe looking at your performance review and any of the payouts that we're doing from our variable incentive comp programs, we would have a version that is published for employees to see. They can access that when they've been released, but also having a version of those same statements that are generated for a manager to see with their talking points on it as well, so that you're helping to guide that manager in having that conversation with the employee about what changes occurred, where they sit within their range, and so on. So that's another unique way to kind of leverage some of the technology as well. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. I know we kind of had a little bit of conversation earlier about AI kind of interspersed into this process. I think that's another area that we could dive pretty deep into, but I think it's also just understanding, um, what the challenges are and where we could potentially leverage AI when we're starting to think about total compensation, total review, or total rewards and such. I think a lot of that has to do with even maybe leveraging it for some of that education and leveraging it for, to your point around looking at how we're doing the market pricing and things like that. So definitely would love to dive into that a little more. But before we go, I do want to go ahead and share just kind of our wrap up here, looking at the key pillars that we've been talking about so far. I think there's been one question, maybe a couple of questions that have been submitted. We'll see if we can get to those as well. But just wanted to reiterate some of those things that we've been talking about around that employee value proposition as really being that foundation. And that's a combination of those monetary or quantifiable values versus those that have an intrinsic value. So again, not necessarily something that we can put a dollar sign to, but things that are important to your employees and making sure that we're managing to that and that clear ongoing communication that we keep emphasizing. Strategic alignment, we've talked about a little bit. Again, we can go on and on about that, but making sure that we're not losing sight of what's the big end goal and that we're actually aligning appropriately as we're building out these different strategies. We definitely dove into considering different priorities, and I look at that in kind of these major areas: personalization, the global considerations that we talked about, generational considerations, and different career stages. Again, all of those different cuts of your organization is really going to help to shape what's important for your particular company. And then different ways that we can leverage technology. So again, we sort of mentioned a lot of that throughout. Any step of the way as we're talking about these different strategies and the different pain points that companies are going through, I don't think we can do any of this without some technology supporting all of these different steps. I'm definitely looking forward to having more conversations with anybody that is wanting to get more out of any of the three of us. With that, I want to just make sure that if we do have any questions, the only one that I can see is here, a couple of them around looking at recommendations for assessing the effectiveness of total rewards programs. So I don't know if we have a couple of minutes for somebody to take that and we can move on.
I think we're actually at time. So Rhonda, we'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah.
And we can address some questions offline if needed.
Absolutely. Would love to have you folks here with us all day. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much to HRSoft and to all three presenters today. For those of you who may have come late or you'd like to view it again, this will be archived shortly on hr.com. You can watch it again at any time. Please fill out the exit survey. It's going to open on your computer once I close out the session before you head into that next session. And to do that, you just go back to the webcast auditorium and hit attend. And then the HRCI insurance credits, those will be in your account within 2 business days. And we will also send you an email with your credit information. All right. Thanks again, Glazelle, Sean, and Michelle. Take great care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.